Hello and welcome to the Product Opscast with Graham Reed and Antonia Landy. Good morning, Antonia. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you, Graham.
Today, we are joined by Taylor Belchak, Head of Operations at Ravio. Now, you might be asking, Graham, this is a Product Up show. What's going on here? Well, Taylor has traversed a number of adjacent roles, including Product Operations at Deliveroo and Chief of Staff at Sedna. And we really wanted to get her on the show for quite a while now to chat through that career, the roles that she has held, and how similar and actually how not similar they are. Taylor, lovely to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me today.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little snapshot of your career, because actually that's a big part of today. We're going to get into kind of your career. So just give us kind of a few headlines and about yourself.
Sure, no, happy to. I'm Taylor Belchak. I'm American, which I feel like I always have to say. I live in the UK. I've lived in London for quite about 8 years now. So this is where my base is now. And I've worked in technology for over 15 years. About half of that time, I specialize in product operations. So I think when Graham's talking about my experience in product ops and moving out of it, that gives you some context. It very much still is, in my opinion, my specialism. And yeah, I started my career in product ops at Google when I was working there. I focused on the digital advertising space and specialized in mobile app advertising and kind of evolved my career when I kind of stepped into leading product operations at Deliveroo. So, kind of overseeing how product ops functioned across all of the different product spaces at Deliveroo at the time. And since then, I've kind of transitioned into more general operations roles, again, as Graham has mentioned. So, more recently, I was working at Sedna, which is a maritime kind of communications B2B SaaS company. And there I actually started there in product ops. The transition from product ops to general ops roles happened within a business, which is probably relevant or interesting to people listening in. I stepped into kind of a chief of staff as well as director of business operations roles. So dabbled in general ops and chief of staff at the same time. And then more recently, I've moved over to Ravio, where I'm leading operations across kind of a variety of functions to support the business. So that's a bit of a snapshot, and hopefully that helps.
It absolutely does. And yeah, we can dive straight in there because, as I said earlier, this is exactly what we wanted to kind of just dive into and hear a lot more about is kind of that journey. Particularly as you've come into product operations, and then how have you navigated those steps to the chief of staff, and then into business operations, and then into out and out operations. The names are very, very similar, but actually there is undoubtedly a huge amount of difference and some steps to overcome. Maybe when you're kind of having to take your product hat off and move much more into the business as well. So let's start there. What were the similarities that you have noticed as you kind of look back and analyze your transitions from your roles between all of those different functions that you held?
Sure. So, in terms of similarities, I think at the end of the day, I've continued to work in operations. And I think, like anyone working in operations, has essentially a very similar mission, which is to kind of organize chaos and drive efficiencies and whatever you can do to make that happen. It might look different in product ops, but ultimately that is kind of the core mission. I think one of the things that's most interesting to me, because that is probably super obvious to the audience, like in operations, we're driving efficiencies. I think one of the key takeaways, or like the single thread that carries through all the roles, is that in order to be effective in operations, which I think everyone wants to be, is that you need to be able to effectively influence change and influence stakeholders in order to adopt whatever change you're trying to put into place. That is probably the crux of my success in any role I've taken on in ops, whether that was product ops or chief of staff or general operations. And kind of one of the things I always say, I continue to say every company I join, is you can build the most beautiful, efficient process in the world. It can be fully intended to organize all the chaos. But if the audience, the people, your users do not adopt it, you will have no impact. So influencing change is, I think, the main thing that I've noticed across all of my roles. And I think what's interesting when you move into operations from product ops is that kind of a slight difference in how you influence change is that your stakeholders are going to be quite different. So in product ops, we're usually working with kind of product teams, tech stakeholders, and bridging that gap with the commercial organization largely. And you're usually focused on roadmap, like product priorities, bug prioritization, those types of topics. When you move out of product ops and into other ops roles, whether that's chief of staff or general operations, that kind of stakeholder group changes drastically and it changes over time. So, in chief of staff specifically, because I know Graham, we talked about that being a really interesting role, I think, for people in product ops. You might be working with the chief finance officer one day and the finance team. You might be working with, the administrative assistant on organizing an on-site, and the head of marketing. You might be working with every single functional head of your business or even all of the employees to influence change. So there is kind of a wide ranging stakeholder set when you move out of product ops and into kind of wider business operations. And that can be a bit challenging and overwhelming to start because you're really used to working with techies and not everyone else kind of thinks the same, has the same priorities. So you do have to kind of adjust and relearn how to navigate your new kind of stakeholder set.
So interesting. One question I've always had, do you feel like chief of staff roles, business operation roles, general operation roles are better understood or more accepted, let's say, by businesses than product operations?
That's a really good question. I think to some extent, yes. But I think that's because there's more history and context for businesses on the need for general operations roles. Usually there's a very clear scope for general operations types of, teams. And with product ops, it is relatively new. I mean, obviously we've been working in it for quite a while. It's not new anymore. But I think especially like when you move outside of, I'm American, I lived in the US, a lot of US companies are invested in product ops because it's been around a lot longer. They've seen the formula work. When I moved to Europe, it was a whole new world. I had to teach my interviewers what product ops was on phone calls because their investors told them they had to hire someone in product ops, but they didn't know what they're hiring for. So I think the challenge for product ops professionals is more knowing really to your core what you're doing, what value you're adding, and being confident enough to like sell the leadership team or at least one leader within the business to be on your side to advocate for product ops. And yeah, I think it is quite challenging, especially in the startup space, because when you're at a smaller organization, it's harder to showcase the need for product ops early on. As a company scales, it becomes very obvious that there are operational gaps in a product organization that were not thought through until they had 20, 30, 40 product managers doing different things, and that's causing operational stress on the business. But yeah, I definitely think it is largely because of more of the historical context, buy-in, consulting firms having documentation on operations more generally. Very rarely is there like a playbook for product ops.
You said a piece earlier, you started to allude to about the stakeholders that you work with when you move into much more general operations. Absolutely, that changes, it's broader. Do you find and what would you describe kind of the different angles that and priorities and even personalities that you find? What's the kind of the operating thought process that those different stakeholders will have when you're working with them in that much more operational capacity? As a, in product operations, when you're working with the commercial teams, that relationship is more frequently about, well, okay, what's product building, when's it coming out the door, what's the roadmaps look like, how do I get involved in those conversations, when are you doing your planning, blah 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 blah. But then when you move to another part of the business, do you find those relationships are different? Do you find that their wants and their needs and where those gaps are different?
Yeah, I mean, I think no matter what, it'll be different because your scope is quite different, right? And it depends on your role. I think in the world of chief of staff, there's a lot less people coming to you because people don't know what you do. And chief of staff changes depending on the organization because, it will be defined whoever you are chief of staff for. So I should caveat that for anyone, interested in chief of staff, like look at who, if you're looking for roles as chief of staff, look at who you're going to be reporting to, what their focus area is, what they're interested in, and if you're going to learn from them, because that's actually the most value you can get out of the chief of staff role is learning from the person you're working with. But yeah, in terms of what's different, yeah, less people coming to you for things, more you going to people to get things done in the chief of staff world. I was working a lot more with, the functional heads of across the business to ensure that kind of we're on track to meet our company-wide objectives, or that we've completed the budget process for forecasting to the next year, chasing them for updates, making sure the processes were fit for purpose for them, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely the dynamic shifts. I think in general operations roles, or like in the current role that I'm in as head of operations, it's fairly similar to my experience with product ops, but you're on a little bit, I hate to say it, like less of a pedestal. I think product generally within an organization is looked up as, okay, they're the ones kind of running the roadmap, the future of the company, where things are going. You're being asked to prioritize things because you have the power to do that. In operations, you're a bit more of, in product ops, you get a little bit of this being the middleman, but your stakeholders don't know that as much. And when you're in ops, you're very much the middleman. So there will be problems that you cannot solve without tech support, and people will be complaining to you about those problems. And you either have to find ways to ensure you can prioritize that and have effective relationships with the tech team, or find alternative ways to solve that within your organization with other methods. So it can be a bit more, I'd say, of a push and pull in ops, but I do think people who have worked in product ops have a bit of a leg up in understanding how to kind of navigate being that bridge between multiple organizations, as well as being able to understand how to prioritize with the tech teams in effective ways, even though your role has changed by moving outside of the tech organization. I don't know if that answered the question, but
Yeah.
hopefully added a little bit of flavor as to what it looks like.
I often think about partnering between ops roles because this is something that I've often found very compelling when I was doing product operations and other ops roles existed, right? So, as a product ops leader, partnering with the chief of staff, partnering with business operations. As somebody who's had, all of the hats, how do you feel about that relationship? Can we get closer? Are there synergies that I feel like we're often still leaving on the table a little bit?
Yeah, 100%. I think what's actually interesting about this is during my time at Sedna, because I was one of the more experienced operations people generally in the business, at the time, the president of the company, who I was chief of staff to, suggested I actually take all of the ops functions under me.
Interesting.
So when I said I was kind of director of biz ops, it was revenue operations, it was product operations, it was sales enablement, it was kind of the full suite. And at one point, I was also overseeing the support team. So, like the support operations. So, in doing that, I know it's not a traditional setup. And at the time, we kept having conversations of this isn't traditional, but the value that we got as a team, I think if you asked any of my team today, if they got any value of working with people who are in different areas of the business, but operationally minded, was extremely valuable. Now, someone in product ops isn't going to go step into revenue ops and tell them what to do, but being able to brainstorm and think about, especially tooling and new ways of doing things, and having the ability to do that with people day to day rather than looking for outside communities of people that understand your business, understand your stakeholders, I think is truly valuable. So that kind of naturally happened at Sedna, and is, I think, something that I'm thinking about at Ravio as well. Although we don't have as many, like most ops people sit with me today, but if it were to scale out, I think it's really important that there is clear connectedness between all of us, because at the end of the day, the data we're using needs to be consistent, which is a big thing I think out there today, especially as we think about AI using disparate pieces of data to make decisions. And so yeah, I think it is critical, and I think if you're in a business that has ops roles that are sitting outside of where your focus is, like create a alternative community where you meet like once a month and just share ideas, share what you're doing. I think there's ways to set that up in a more informal way without kind of leadership oversight or involvement, because there's a ton of value in learning from your peers.
Yeah, I love that. I think the way I try to think about it is what information do I have, or what information am I the shepherd of that can unlock or elevate you even further? And I think once
Yeah.
you start building those bridges, it really becomes a force multiplier.
Yes, exactly.
It's really interesting as you're talking about the other ops roles, because I remember a conversation with Hugo Froese, probably well over a year ago now, whereby talking about kind of this kind of almost sub layer, almost lattice layer of ops roles within the business that, you know, has connectivity in a similar way that the more mainstream divisions, departments, and they're the ICs and the leaders, they all communicate and they all work. Then you've got the ops layers that are then working together, almost a little bit under the hood, almost a little bit in the shadows to kind of say, well, how do we make sure that kind of the communication and the data and everything that's moving across the business is happening quite seamlessly, so that actually you've got a well-oiled machine in a way that many people are kind of almost scurrying around doing all of this without the rest of the population actually realizing this. So it's really, really very interesting to sort of to hear both from both of you about that, having that connectivity, having that relationship and that partnering with those other ops type roles. And is that something that you've kind of experienced and you've done, Taylor?
Yeah, I think even not in a formal way, even within like Deliveroo or Google, you need to have a close relationship with other operations roles because a lot of what you're building or setting up will impact their teams. I think in particular, I think about support operations. And actually, at one point, Ed said and I was doing both support and product ops and found a lot of synergies between the two because a lot of what you're releasing in product is going to affect support, and a lot of what support's seeing is affecting prioritization and vice versa. So I do think, like, at the end of the day, you're going to have those stakeholders regardless. Maybe if you more formally acknowledge like the importance of working together and having clear lines, of communication, it can really add additional value to the work that you're doing.
And so you've alluded to this as well. Have you got any flavour to add to this as well? You know, kind of working with those other ops roles.
Yeah, I think especially it's support and sales, right? That I always keep coming back to. I think there are a lot of synergies to be had in marketing as well, especially now that, the kind of, I think, main effort will become less can we build it? It will become will people adopt it? But I think historically, it's exactly as Taylor mentioned, right? Like, especially support, right? They are the next line of defense for anything you put out there. And on the inverse, they receive things that should color and inform how you prioritize and what you prioritize. I think it's a very similar story in B2B with sales teams, right? You need to empower them to show off your product in the best possible way, right? You can do that with information, you can do that with regular updates. They need to have confidence, right, in what they are selling, and you can be a big part of giving them that confidence. But again, on the inverse, they are speaking to people every single day. They are such a treasure trove of what's happening on the ground. And you might find nuggets of wisdom in there that you can really use, and it can become a competitive advantage to your product team if you know how to shape it, right? And I think that's where I tend to say that unless everybody in your company has a so-called product mindset, nobody really has, right? You cannot do product in a vacuum. Your entire organization needs to be on board and needs to have that understanding of where the value in defining problems, defining opportunities lie. And I think product ops is such a good conduit for that.
Yeah, and it's that conduit, isn't it? It's it's that ability to influence on how we're absorbing that product information. not the absorption of it, not the creation of it, not even the soapbox, celebration of what we have done and the evangelism of it, but actually making sure that the conduit for that is effective, that people are being receptive to, why these products are great and how you can use them and how you should be selling them and I come back to something years ago whereby at a business we were selling apps to schools, and we'd had an app that was one of the very first to market in this particular area, and sales were really starting to decline. People just weren't interested in it anymore, and partly that was because times had moved on. There were many more choices on the thing, but also found that the sales teams were going out and selling it for one thing only. We had a whole treasure trove of features that we had built, but the sales teams were still going out and selling it for this one very basic feature that had now long been overtaken. And I'm just like, why? Why? There's so much more else here. And so that, there was communication problems, and there was almost sales training problems that we need to kind of, address. And this is long before I was in product ops. So, absolutely that communication piece is key. Moving on a little bit, and it wouldn't be a show in 2026 if we didn't talk about AI. And Taylor, I'd be really interested to hear, because in the product ops communications circles, it's all AI and what are you doing with AI? And is AI going to take over product ops? And is it taking over X, Y, and Z? And how are you guarding against it? Blah, 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 blah. How is AI impacting the more traditional ops roles and sector?
Great question. So I think I actually had to think about this morning because it's all we talk about, I think, at work now. And yeah, so I think AI is permeating everything, and we're looking at every potential avenue to leverage AI to automate, to reduce, the amount of time things take, to improve efficiencies. And I think that's just everywhere across the board in any business, right? And that is especially true in operations, whether it's product ops or other operations roles. I know when I first entered operations, we always talked about driving efficiencies to remove our jobs. So I think like operations has always had that mindset. It's just all of a sudden now everyone's thinking in the same way. And in my opinion, AI is essentially just another tool for us to do that, to achieve that goal of removing us to ever be needed from anything ever. So as much as it feels like, I guess, in product ops or whatever role you're in, oh, AI is going to take over my job. To be honest, we've always been trying to get rid of our jobs. That's our entire job, really. So that's kind of one of my perspectives on it. How we're looking at it from like a general ops perspective, I think it helps if you know some of the teams that I'm working with today. So we have, I oversee our kind of end-to-end customer onboarding journey. We have an integrations team setting up third-party integrations. We have product support, which is a team that I set up when I joined. And we also have a team looking at kind of the data we receive from customers. And it's a bit of a data labeling exercise, which is extremely rife for automation and enablement from AI. The things that are top of mind, I think, for me right now is how can we incorporate AI smartly? And the two areas I think about are first and foremost, I think a lot of leaders are looking at like the sexiest things in the business that they can automate to show customers, to kind of get that investor value, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the like minor tasks that are really boring and broken and causing issues across the business are probably the areas we should be focusing on. It's the easiest places to automate. It's going to have the most impact, and it's the stuff that people don't enjoy doing. So that's kind of one piece that, I'm focused on with my teams right now, especially in support. Support's a really good area for automation. AI chatbots are all the rage right now. They're much better than they used to have been. But also, how can we automate troubleshooting information? So when a ticket comes in, you already have the steps to take if it's not able to be resolved immediately by AI. So how do we continually drive efficiencies there? On the data labeling side, there's a lot we can do. So how do we train AI based on our experts who are doing that data labeling exercise today and have AI slowly take that over and become more and more efficient? But one of the biggest challenges with that I think everyone should be thinking about is how do we maintain expertise while bringing AI in? Because at the end of the day, you're still going to need humans, at least right now, to be a sparring partner with AI. You're going to have to train it on the areas that it has weaknesses in. When it gets new data sets that it's never seen before, it's going to need that expertise and that support. And yes, we can have AI take over a portion of the work, but we're going to have to think about, how do we maintain a level of expertise? Sure, we have experts today. What if those experts leave? How do you make sure you have a path for training people to be able to be those experts in the future? So one of the things my team is thinking about is, what does that look like for us? How do we make sure we have a path to build expertise and can leverage AI to drive efficiencies as much as possible, but we don't lose that human element that we will inevitably need, either because, people leave the business, we need that expertise to train the model, or because the model breaks down and one day we're going to need a human to do it again, right? Or it starts to cost a lot of money and we decide we don't want to invest that much in it. All of these things are future proofing, which I think a lot of ops people will, is how our minds think. Risk analysis. How do we make sure we set ourselves up for the future? And that's where my head is at right now. And some of the things I guess my team and I am thinking about, and how we can use AI, but like smartly and for the most impact for our money.
Super, super interesting. And the thing it keeps coming back to for me is data, right? And context. And I'm curious to hear what role data and context played for you when you were doing product operations exclusively, and when you were moving out to a broader or maybe also more strategic level of operations, chief of staffing. You need a common language, right? You need a source of truth. I think concepts need to persist throughout all the different departments.
Yeah.
I think product ops is closer to data in a tech environment a lot of the time than maybe a more general ops practitioner might be. And I'm wondering if I'm right on the money, if I'm completely wrong, right? But yeah, I'm also just curious, how do you enable that kind of single source of truth in the different ops roles you've had?
So I actually think data is very relevant in ops in general. I think one of the things that I've carried from my product experience through to operations is being extremely data driven. I think maybe the data you're looking at is sometimes different, and that's really where the variation lies. How I've used data in operations is, obviously now I'm a leader of a team. So I've set up kind of really traditional KPIs. I think it's very common in support to have very standard KPIs. I think where it's most interesting is connecting the dots on certain processes across the organization using data and understanding kind of areas where there's opportunity for automation or efficiency driving. One category in particular that seems to keep coming up in all of my ops roles that are outside of product ops is customer onboarding. So obviously I'm kind of overseeing that at Ravio, but even during my time at Sedna, this was a project that I was put on as chief of staff to assess the end-to-end journey of our customer onboardings. In B2B software, that's really critical to make sure customer satisfaction is high, the first experience with your product and service is a positive one, reducing churn, all of these things. And so kind of connecting the dots between the point of, contract signed all the way through to implementation and product onboarding and, gathering their data and processing it and having that experience be very seamless, frictionless, and positive is really important for B2B SaaS companies. And both of my last companies are B2B SaaS. So we pulled all the data across CRMs, the CRM system, Salesforce, HubSpot, whatever it is, all the data around tickets, like any tickets that are associated with onboardings, any bugs that are associated with integrations, all of this information to aggregate it and understand where across the journey we're hitting the roadblocks that are having the most negative impact on our customers, and how to resolve it. I think the other aspect of data that's really interesting, again, for people in product ops who won't be as familiar with general ops, is capacity planning. Not super sexy, but very much needed. So again, coming back to the team that does the data processing, I need to know at any point in time how many data points we can process by one person within a specific set period of time. I need to be able to understand, are we below, at, above capacity? Do we need to shift their other workload in order to ensure we can move that data through because it's part of the customer onboarding journey? Where can we put automation in to increase the number of data points that they can process in that time? And then how do we forecast? How many data points do we think we're going to get in the next 6 to 12 months? Do we have enough humans to do that? Can AI do it for us? How are we planning the timing of the AI rollout of new tooling, et cetera, to expedite that and ensure we're prepared to scale if our business scales? So, like I said, I think the data is a little different. Like the world in which you're working is going to be different. Also, I'm working in a very specific area of operations right now, but I think the capacity planning in particular will be relevant probably across any operations organization, especially as a leader looking at that.
Very interesting. I'd like
Yeah.
to come back just briefly to customer onboarding and the work that you're doing there, because fundamental question: who owns this in a business? Because and it's obviously different for every business, but we're talking from the moment that, I mean, actually before you've even got the customer, it's the whole marketing journey to then acquiring that customer, to then onboarding that customer, then being a customer, and ultimately then offboarding the customer. That customer journey is a part that transcends every part, or almost every part of a business. And conceptually, there's not many areas that do that. Within a business construct. So, is this an area that actually does need an owner? Whether that is the chief of staff, whether it is out and out operations, or is it something that should be kind of taken in chunks by each individual part of the business and then handed over? Well, what's your thoughts and what's your experience on this?
Yeah, I think if your customer onboarding journey is perfectly set up and you've done it in the right way, which I haven't seen much of, but if it is, in theory, it would have owners for each aspect with agreed upon handoffs that are seamless. Or you also have a path for self-serve onboarding. Ideally, everything's self-serve onboarding, right? But in B2B SaaS, there's a lot more technical nuance, and there usually is a need for at least one, enterprise layer type of onboarding journey. What I would say is my perspective, and people might disagree, is that if you are looking to kind of put forward an effort to improve your customer onboarding, I think you need a single owner looking at it. You don't need to have that person fixing everything, but you kind of need a project manager, someone who is at the end of the day responsible for the KPI of reducing the time to onboard, improving that onboarding experience, the CSAT, whatever it is, and focusing on ensuring those handovers are seamless, ensuring that each step is done properly, etc., and allowing you to get to that phase where you do have that kind of well-oiled machine. And then, in my opinion, it would be ensuring that each of those pieces has clear metrics, monitoring how their function is doing in the onboarding, as well as the handoff. So if a handoff is all of a sudden going poorly, making sure you have a metrics like error rates of integrations or whatever that is, so that those two stakeholder groups can, make sure to resolve it together rather than, pointing the finger and saying, this is you, this is me, what have you. The way I'm thinking about it right now within my business is my team owns the technical operational layer of onboarding. And so we need to ensure we have a very clear understanding of what all of that entails and what all of our KPIs are across that journey. Then we have the CS team in my organization. It's largely CS, but also a little bit of sales, as you mentioned, with the handover to CS, but largely CS owning the customer onboarding journey from a commercial lens. So basically, ops and commercial, or CS, are going to be working very, very closely as a partner on this. But most likely, we're still in the early stages of my pitch, but I imagine given a lot of the issues are arising more on the technical side, that I will probably be more so owning the initiative to overhaul it. So I think at the end of the day, you can't have multiple owners when you're trying to fix a problem, but you can have multiple owners when you're in maintenance mode and you have clear kind of KPIs and ways to monitor and track performance.
Yeah, super, super interesting. I feel like up until now, we've talked quite a lot about the similarities and the nuances. I would love to hear from you. let's say we have somebody listening in right now who is in product operations, has been doing product ops for a while, and is maybe looking for their next challenge. And maybe that's a chief of staff role, maybe that's a more general operations role. What would you tell them to upskill in? What skills, what knowledge does product ops not have or not cover that would really make you shine in a chief of staff or a general ops role?
That's a really great question. I might flip this a little bit, but what I would say, I think at a high level, what I'll say is it's really challenging to train yourself to do a role without stepping into it. I think what you need to do is really be prepared for anything that you've not experienced before in product operations and be open to not knowing the answer and learning. I do think that having worked in product, product ops specialists and experts will have really good playbooks of what to do in a problem space that they're not familiar with because, the product mindset does enable you with various tools. We talked about being data driven, using data to make decisions, understanding, the product development cycle, going from discovery all the way to kind of launching and iterating. That stuff can be applied to process to any problem space you enter. What I think it might be more interesting maybe for the audience is because once you step into a space, it might be helpful to know what's going to be different and that you can't really prepare yourself for because every function, every organization is going to be slightly nuanced. But essentially, especially in chief of staff, there is a bit of an unlearning that you need to do. So coming from product ops, you tend to be a bit more system driven, trying to drive efficiencies in process, quickly getting impact out, trying to make sure you have, the right processes in place, you're driving change, and that is affecting day-to-day work. When you move into a chief of staff role, you might still be doing a little bit of that. I kind of talked about the onboarding experience project I worked on. But a large majority of what your work is going to be is enabling and empowering the leadership team or your specific kind of leader to be effective in their role. And that means you have to change your pace and your approach because your goal is, rather than driving quick efficiency, improvements across an org is to make sure people are having the right conversations, are debating the right topics, have the right level of energy to collaborate and kind of have the space and the time and the format and the forums within which they can make strategic business decisions. And that is a really big change. Going from moving quick to being like, we need 2 hours to talk about this one topic because 5 people need to agree on it is a very, very big change. And I think the other thing to acknowledge is when working with executives, you're working with very time poor people that have low energy a lot of the time because they're in so many meetings. They don't have time to look at detail. Frankly, they won't have time to follow your process. So you have to meet them where they are, see what the best approach is to get what you need to get out of them. And that is a really big change.
Mm.
And I think it's important to acknowledge too, because the decisions that your domain now, especially as chief of staff that you're supporting, those decisions that they're making are going to make really, huge impact. Like they will change how the company works potentially. So making sure that these decisions are well thought out is really, really important because once you get to execution, then everything will come to fruition. But all of your leaders really need to be aligned and it can kind of affect the rest of your business. I think the biggest unlearning is we kind of touched on this before, but it's basically moving from being an insider, being the person helping make product decisions, prioritizing, guiding the decision-making process, to being a stakeholder, being basically a customer of the product organization. And that is frankly a very hard pill to swallow the first time you step into this type of role. You know how product works, but you're not allowed to influence it. I mean, you can obviously, but ultimately there's someone else owning that piece of the pie. And so you have to learn to use your skill set, use your knowledge of how product works to be a really good stakeholder, to support prioritization from your side so that your team is moving as quickly as possible and ensure that you have good relationships with the tech team. But I do think that people moving from product ops to general ops have a bit of a superpower because you actually know how these decisions are made. You can leverage that understanding to help prioritize your own team's workload before the roadmap is published, which we know, is always moving, always changing. They promise you something in Q2, it doesn't come. So, but you have a more realistic approach to how you would run your team or how would you run your projects because you know how the tech organization functions. And so I'd say those are kind of the nuances between chief of staff and kind of general ops that you might not realize until you step into those roles.
I have one last question for you. Reflecting back, so you've gone from product ops to chief of staff to ops. If you could do your time again, do you feel that journey, and I know this is a very, very difficult question to answer, but do you think that the direction of that journey has, I won't say helped, but is the right way round? And what I'm thinking here is if you've got people that are wanting to come in the opposite direction, that are more general ops and or maybe our chief of staff and are looking specifically to product ops roles, do you feel that journey is, I wouldn't say easier, but has, you can take things from that journey? Because something that we've always talked about, Antonio, as well, is, what are the transferable skills to get into product ops? So, Taylor, what do you feel are those transferable skills potentially that are coming in that direction?
Look, I think I'll be really honest. I think it has been an easier journey for me coming from product ops, moving into more general operations roles because product and tech is extremely challenging to level up in. And frankly, especially in tech, I'm assuming most people listening in are working in the tech space. But most companies are product driven, are, tech team driven. Decisions being made across the business are, decided by most of what's happening in the tech space. And so having that understanding of how products work, how the technology is integrated, why certain things are breaking down and affecting your teams is really, really valuable. I think if you're coming from more of an general operations role or chief of staff type of role, you will the things you have to learn are quite drastically different. So moving from product ops to general ops, you're learning stakeholder management changes and maybe, different types of data you're looking at, but those are not that difficult to up level on. You already know how to look at data. You already know how to do data analysis. You know how to navigate difficult stakeholders. You can, dynamically change that. You can learn that really quickly. I think going from the other direction, you have to learn how product and tech teams work. You have to learn kind of sprint planning and kind of prioritization discussions. You need to learn the roots of the technology, like why certain things are built on this. Why does infrastructure matter? Why are we prioritizing all of these bugs against new feature releases? Like, how are these decisions being made? You need to have an idea how to scope things. Whether or not you have to do that in your work, you at least have an idea how long is this project going to take a tech team. And that I think is basically very difficult to learn without having that product and tech experience. Now, can someone learn it? For sure. I think it is something you can step in if you are someone eager to learn and upskill, you'll be able to get there. But there is a level of confidence as well working in the product and tech organization. And if you struggle with having confidence in yourself, it can be a little daunting to be standing up to an engineering manager who is probably getting paid twice as much as you. Like just thinking about the dynamics in an organization, I personally think it's quite challenging or would be quite challenging going the other direction. Now, that to say, like I started my career, which I didn't really mention, more in, I guess, tech support. So I was more in the product support space and that turned into product operations. But again, I still came from the product side of things. I was working in the product, knew how the product worked. And I do think that gives you a bit of a leg up. But yeah, I think it's up to people to really assess, do they think product ops would be a good fit or interesting to them? They'll have the skill sets and the ability to step into problem spaces and drive efficiencies. I mean, that is critical to the role, right? But I'd say the bit that they would need to learn is the confidence and the detail of how products function and how tech teams function. And maybe for those individuals, learning a little bit more about that before stepping into that type of role would actually be of value.
Really very interesting. Antonio, any comments from yourself on that and that journey into product ops?
I think you've really hit the nail on the head. It is learning about how products get discovered, how opportunities get discovered, how to frame those, how to compare, all of the different things you may be able to do and choose the one that you're betting on, and then measuring, iterating, all of that. It's a mindset shift, right? It's a fundamental change in how we as humans want to operate. We like certainty. We like a very concrete plan that takes us from A to B to C. And in product, you do not have that luxury. A lot of the time, you have to learn to deal with a lot of ambiguity, to consistently reframe things, reevaluate whether you're still on the right track. And I think learning as much as you can about how to do that shift, kind of going through the motions yourself, practicing, right, that kind of shift is really, really important if you want to step into a product ops role or a product role, right, more generally, from somewhere that is not product adjacent at all.
Thank you. Brilliant. Some really, really very interesting journey, Taylor, that you shared with us
Yeah,
today.
thank you.
Really want to thank you. As our special guest today, we are out of time, but very much would like to thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much both for having me. It's been a true pleasure. It's been fun to talk a little bit about product ops again. I don't get to chat about it as much in my day to day. So thank you.
It's been a great opportunity to just learn a lot about these kind of roles that we do see that are kind of very similar but have their nuance and difference. So thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. To our audience, that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. Antonia and I will be back on the next episode of the Product Opscast. Thank you very much.